The first day. Jasmine King entered the classroom with her head held high, yet inside, she felt a tightening in her chest. The anticipation of her first day at Westfield High had been building up for weeks, but now that she was actually here, it was nothing like she imagined. The school had a reputation for being prestigious, full of bright students with high expectations. Jasmine wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of environment. She had attended other elite schools before, each time adapting quickly to her new surroundings. But this was different. This wasn't just a new school, it was a new level of scrutiny, a new set of unspoken rules she had yet to decipher. As she walked into the classroom, her eyes briefly scanned the faces of her new classmates. They seemed like an impenetrable group, already bonded by shared experiences. Most of them appeared to know each other, some exchanging whispered conversations, others simply sitting in their seats, already absorbed in their own worlds. Jasmine's entrance interrupted their routine, and for a split second, it felt as though time had slowed. Every head in the room turned to look at her. There were no welcoming smiles, no warm gestures. Instead, she felt the weight of 1,000 silent judgments. She had been the new kid before, but this was different. Here, she was the odd one out, and she could feel it. At the front of the room, Miss Roberts stood as though she had been expecting her all along. She was a woman of medium height, with sharp features that gave her an almost imposing presence. Her dark eyes scanned Jasmine as if she were a specimen on display, her lips pressed into a tight line. Miss Roberts' posture was perfect, her arms crossed over her chest in a way that made it clear she was in control of the room. Everything about her screamed authority, an authority she wasn't afraid to wield with a heavy hand. The first words that came out of Miss Roberts' mouth weren't welcoming, they weren't warm either. Instead, they were cutting, almost too deliberate in their delivery. "Everyone," she began, her voice rich with a kind of calculated slowness, "we have a new addition today. Jasmine King, right?" She emphasized Jasmine's name with an unsettling pause, her eyes briefly lingering on her, as though evaluating every detail from the way she stood to the color of her shoes. "I trust you're prepared for our rigorous curriculum." Jasmine felt a faint flush creeping up her neck. It wasn't the fact that Miss Roberts had acknowledged her in front of the class, she was used to that. It was the way she said rigorous, the way she practically challenged Jasmine with the word. It was as though Miss Roberts wanted to test her from the very first moment, to see if she could meet her high expectations. But Jasmine wasn't about to show any weakness. "I'm ready," Jasmine replied, keeping her tone steady. She sat down, making sure her movements were deliberate and calm, hoping to convey an air of confidence that she didn't fully feel. She refused to let Miss Roberts see any vulnerability, even though a part of her felt as though she had already been branded. Her seat was near the middle of the room, and as she settled into it, she could feel the eyes of the other students still on her. A few of them looked at her with curiosity, but most of them returned to their own conversations, as though the moment had passed and she was already becoming a part of the scenery. There were no loud whispers, no overt comments, but Jasmine could tell the social dynamics had shifted. She was an unknown, a disruption to the flow of the class, and no one quite knew how to approach her. She glanced to her right and saw a girl with light brown hair and pale skin giving her a slight, welcoming smile. Jasmine nodded back politely but didn't engage. She wasn't here to make friends, she was here to survive the day, to make it through the class without drawing attention to herself. But of course, Miss Roberts wasn't done with her yet. The lesson began, and Miss Roberts launched into a discussion about the novel they were reading, a classic piece of literature that Jasmine had already studied at her previous schools. The teacher's voice was smooth and confident, each word coming with the expectation that the students would grasp every nuance, every hidden meaning. Jasmine didn't find it difficult to follow along, but she could feel Miss Roberts' eyes on her, every time the teacher made a point of calling on someone. When Miss Roberts asked a question about the protagonist's internal conflict, Jasmine raised her hand, along with several others. There was a brief moment when the teacher's gaze scanned the room, and for some reason, it landed on Jasmine. Her expression remained unchanged, but something about the way Miss Roberts looked at her made Jasmine feel as though she was being scrutinized more intensely than the others. "Jasmine?" Miss Roberts said, her voice almost too neutral, as though testing the waters. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She had already been made to feel like an outsider. This wasn't the time to take center stage. But Miss Roberts had called on her, and Jasmine couldn't back down now. The protagonist's internal conflict, Jasmine began, her voice steady, stems from his struggle to choose between his loyalty to his family and his desire to live a life of his own, free from the constraints placed upon him. His journey is about reconciling those two opposing forces, ultimately realizing that to grow, he has to break free from his past. There was a brief silence as Miss Roberts processed Jasmine's answer. The other students seemed to be listening too, some nodding in agreement, others unsure. Jasmine wasn't worried about their reactions, but she couldn't help but notice the small shift in Miss Roberts' posture. It was subtle, but it was there, an imperceptible narrowing of her eyes, as though she had expected something different. "Interesting," Miss Roberts said slowly. "But I think you might be oversimplifying things. Perhaps you didn't catch the deeper themes that the author is working with. Loyalty and independence, yes, but there's also the question of identity, of self-awareness. I would have expected more insight from you, Jasmine." Jasmine bit back the urge to retort. She knew exactly what Miss Roberts was doing, trying to undermine her. It wasn't about the literature, not really. It was about asserting dominance, about putting Jasmine in her place. But Jasmine wasn't going to let it get to her. Instead, she nodded politely, offering a quiet, "I'll take that into consideration." But inside, she was already making a mental note. Miss Roberts was no ordinary teacher. She was someone who valued power, and right now, Jasmine was nothing more than a challenge to be defeated. And yet, Jasmine refused to let that power control her. In the midst of the subtle tension between them, something else was brewing, Jasmine's silent resolve. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. If Miss Roberts wanted to make her life difficult, so be it. But Jasmine wasn't going to let her win. She wasn't going to let anyone define her based on their preconceived notions. She was here to make her mark, not as the daughter of the principal, but as Jasmine King, a student with her own strengths, her own voice, and her own determination to succeed. She might have been an outsider in this classroom, but she would make sure that, by the end of the year, no one would forget her name. The underestimated student. The days stretched into weeks, and as time passed, Jasmine found herself becoming more attuned to the dynamics of the class. While the other students settled into their routines, it was clear that Miss Roberts had already decided how she viewed Jasmine. The teacher's eyes would often linger on her, a subtle tension between them that seemed to grow with every passing day. Miss Roberts didn't just treat Jasmine as the new girl, she treated her as someone who was beneath her, someone who would falter and fail. Jasmine didn't mind the whispers that circulated behind her back, the half-hearted glances, the occasional snide remark thrown her way when Miss Roberts wasn't around. It was the subtle, constant undermining that wore on her. She had been through worse in other schools, students who judged her because of her background, teachers who saw her as different and therefore, unworthy of the same respect given to others. But what made Miss Roberts' behavior unique was its consistency. It wasn't just one offhand comment or a single embarrassing moment. It was a pattern. It was the way the teacher always seemed to find fault with Jasmine, even when there was none. On one particularly tense afternoon, the class was tasked with analyzing a passage from the book they were reading. The assignment required each student to pick a section of the text and offer a personal interpretation, backed by evidence from the story. Jasmine had already read the material the night before, so she felt confident. She had chosen a passage about the protagonist's struggle between duty to his family and the desire for personal freedom, a theme she had experienced in her own life, navigating the expectations placed on her by others. When Miss Roberts called on her, Jasmine straightened in her seat, ready to speak. "Jasmine," Miss Roberts said, her tone flat. "What's your take on this passage? Do you think the protagonist's choices reflect a greater cultural or moral dilemma, or is it simply a matter of personal desire versus familial obligation?" Jasmine paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had already anticipated the question, having reflected on it while reading. She understood the complexity of the issue and could see how the protagonist's choices were influenced by larger societal forces. "The protagonist's struggle isn't just internal," Jasmine began, her voice calm but deliberate. "It represents a tension between two competing forces, the individual's personal desires and the responsibility they feel toward their family and community. It's not just about the character's wants, it's about how cultural values shape decisions. The protagonist is forced to question whether their duty to family is more important than their pursuit of self-identity." Jasmine spoke with conviction, her words flowing with ease, as though she were speaking her truth. She had always excelled at understanding the deeper layers of stories, especially those that mirrored her own experiences. Miss Roberts' response, however, wasn't what Jasmine expected. Rather than acknowledging the depth of Jasmine's analysis, Miss Roberts scoffed, her lips curling into a barely noticeable sneer. "Ah, I see. You're taking a very idealistic view of this, Jasmine," she said. "The truth is, the character isn't struggling with some grand cultural dilemma. It's just about him wanting to break free from the shackles of his family's expectations. It's a personal issue, nothing more." Jasmine felt a flash of frustration. Miss Roberts was missing the point. The protagonist's conflict was far deeper than just a simple desire for independence, it was about finding a balance between two worlds. But Miss Roberts wasn't interested in the complexity of the character's journey. She had already decided that Jasmine didn't have the ability to see beyond surface-level analysis. The other students seemed to sense the shift in the room, and Jasmine felt their eyes on her. Some were watching with mild curiosity, others with indifference, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Roberts' disdain had now become something more obvious, something tangible. It wasn't just that the teacher disagreed with her interpretation, it was that she actively sought to belittle her. As Miss Roberts moved on to the next student, Jasmine sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. She didn't care about the teacher's opinion. What bothered her more was the growing realization that Miss Roberts was playing a game of power, one that Jasmine wasn't sure how to win. Miss Roberts had a way of turning every exchange into a test of strength, and Jasmine wasn't sure how much longer she could endure it without revealing more of herself than she intended. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and the students quickly gathered their things. Jasmine stood slowly, gathering her books, trying to ignore the quiet murmur of voices around her. She felt the tension in the air, as though everyone could sense the unease between her and Miss Roberts. But she refused to show weakness. She wasn't going to let this woman, or anyone, define her. Walking out of the classroom, Jasmine caught a glimpse of the teacher standing by the doorway, watching her leave. There was a coldness in Miss Roberts' eyes, an unspoken challenge that seemed to say, "You won't last here. Not if you continue to resist me." But Jasmine wasn't about to let her win. She had faced challenges like this before, people who assumed they could break her down, who thought they could control her by playing with her emotions, her confidence. She wasn't the same girl she had been in her previous schools. She had learned how to stand tall in the face of adversity, how to take the hits and keep moving forward. As she walked down the hallway, Jasmine's thoughts turned inward. She knew what Miss Roberts was doing. The teacher's passive-aggressive tactics were meant to wear her down, to chip away at her sense of self. But Jasmine wouldn't let her. She wouldn't let this woman or anyone else undermine her. That night, Jasmine went home and threw herself into her studies. She read the assigned chapters with a focus she hadn't felt before. She wasn't going to let Miss Roberts' treatment of her distract her from the one thing she could control, her performance in class. She knew that her grades, her work ethic, and her intellect were the best weapons she had against people who underestimated her. The next day, Miss Roberts assigned a group project, and Jasmine was paired with 3 other students. She felt a twinge of unease when she saw that 2 of her group members were the same students who had made subtle remarks behind her back in previous days. One of them, a girl named Tiffany, had been especially vocal in her disapproval of Jasmine's overconfidence during class discussions. The other, a boy named Kyle, was known for his quiet but biting sarcasm. It was clear that they weren't thrilled to be working with her, and Jasmine knew it would be an uphill battle to gain their trust. But she wasn't about to back down. She had seen enough of their attitudes to know that they were both followers, easily swayed by the opinions of someone like Miss Roberts. As the group began to brainstorm ideas for their project, Jasmine took charge. She didn't wait for someone else to step up. Let's focus on the protagonist's internal conflict, she suggested, and explore how it reflects broader societal themes. We can draw comparisons to real-world issues, like cultural expectations and personal freedom. Tiffany rolled her eyes. Yeah, that's cute, she said, leaning back in her chair. But we're just supposed to analyze the text. We don't need all that extra stuff. Jasmine ignored her, maintaining a calm demeanor. It's not extra. It's about going deeper. If we want to stand out in this project, we need to give Miss Roberts something she can't ignore. Kyle shot her a skeptical look, but Jasmine held his gaze. We're doing this my way, she said. If you don't want to contribute, fine. But I'm not going to let this project be another chance for Miss Roberts to undermine me. The tension in the group was palpable, but Jasmine wasn't backing down. She continued to lead the discussion, pulling ideas from the group and organizing them into a coherent structure. As the days passed, her determination started to pay off. Kyle and Tiffany began to contribute more, realizing that Jasmine wasn't just trying to be difficult, she was trying to excel. The project, when completed, was a masterpiece. It wasn't just an analysis of the text, it was an exploration of themes that resonated beyond the classroom. When Miss Roberts saw their work, she couldn't hide her surprise. Well, she said, her voice tight with a mixture of begrudging respect and thinly veiled annoyance. It seems you've put more effort into this than I expected. But don't think I'm impressed. Jasmine smiled, her confidence solidifying. She had won this round. The turning point. As the weeks went on, the tension between Jasmine and Miss Roberts grew more palpable, like an invisible storm cloud hanging over the classroom. Despite her attempts to remain unaffected, Jasmine couldn't ignore the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that Miss Roberts continued to undermine her. There were no grand moments of humiliation, nothing overt that could be pointed to as an outright attack. It was the small things, the dismissive comments, the way Miss Roberts would intentionally call on other students during discussions, as if to make sure Jasmine's opinions were never fully acknowledged. And yet, Jasmine wasn't backing down. In some ways, she was almost enjoying the challenge. She'd always been a fighter, always found ways to turn the tables when people underestimated her. Miss Roberts didn't realize it yet, but every attempt to belittle Jasmine only fueled her determination to rise higher. One afternoon, as the class gathered for a group discussion, Miss Roberts made a move that would change the dynamic of their relationship forever. The assignment that day was to prepare a short presentation on a passage from the novel they had been reading. Each group was tasked with analyzing a specific scene, and while some of her classmates treated it like just another homework assignment, Jasmine saw it as an opportunity to prove herself once again. She wasn't just going to complete this task, she was going to make it memorable. Her group, consisting of Kyle, Tiffany, and a quiet girl named Lily, had initially been resistant to her leadership. Kyle had remained skeptical of her approach, Tiffany had rolled her eyes at every suggestion Jasmine made, and Lily had kept her head down, offering little more than the occasional nod. But Jasmine wasn't one to let that discourage her. She kept pushing forward, guiding the group with the quiet authority that Miss Roberts clearly didn't expect. "Let's focus on the protagonist's relationship with his family in this scene," Jasmine suggested during one of their meetings. "We'll explore the impact of their expectations on his choices, and how that mirrors the struggle between societal pressure and individual freedom." Tiffany immediately shot back. "That's what we did last time. Can't we do something different? You always go for the deep stuff." Jasmine held her ground. "It's not about being deep, Tiffany. It's about giving our presentation substance. We're not here to just skim the surface. This scene is crucial to understanding the protagonist's inner conflict." Kyle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I don't know. It sounds a bit too complicated. We're supposed to make this easy for everyone to understand, right?" Jasmine looked directly at him, her voice calm but firm. "If we want Miss Roberts to take us seriously, we have to show that we understand the complexity of the text. We won't win her approval by simplifying things." Lily finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "I think Jasmine's right. We need to show that we've put thought into this." "I agree with her approach." Kyle and Tiffany exchanged a brief look before begrudgingly nodding in agreement. They had learned, albeit reluctantly, that Jasmine wasn't going to let them take shortcuts. She wouldn't settle for anything less than excellence. The next few days were spent crafting the presentation, and Jasmine poured every ounce of her focus into it. She didn't just want to impress Miss Roberts, she wanted to prove to herself that she could excel in an environment where she was constantly being pushed down. The project became a personal mission, and as the day of the presentation drew closer, she found herself more determined than ever. When the day arrived, Jasmine stood at the front of the class with her group. The room was silent as Miss Roberts sat in the front row, her arms folded, her eyes narrowed. She had that look, the one that made it clear she was waiting for Jasmine to stumble, to reveal that she wasn't as capable as she appeared. But Jasmine was prepared. She glanced at her group, who stood behind her, their faces a mix of nervousness and reluctant admiration. Kyle, Tiffany, and Lily had come to realize that Jasmine wasn't just trying to show off, she was trying to lead them to success. And that success meant more than just earning a good grade, it meant showing Miss Roberts that she wasn't going to be so easily dismissed. "Today, we'll be presenting an analysis of a crucial moment in the novel," Jasmine began, her voice clear and steady. "This scene marks a turning point for the protagonist, a moment where he is forced to confront the conflicting pressures of loyalty to his family and the desire for personal freedom. Our analysis will focus on how these pressures shape his choices and how they mirror the broader societal expectations placed on individuals." As Jasmine spoke, she could feel Miss Roberts' gaze fixed on her, intense and unwavering. The teacher hadn't said a word, but Jasmine could sense that she was sizing her up, waiting for any flaw, any misstep that would give her a reason to dismiss this presentation as just another attempt by the new girl to make a statement. But Jasmine didn't falter. She spoke with conviction, her analysis sharp and insightful. She broke down the protagonist's emotional conflict, drawing connections between the text and real-world issues that everyone in the class could relate to. She didn't try to oversimplify things. Instead, she showed the complexity of the situation, making it clear that the protagonist's struggle wasn't just an individual one, it was a reflection of the universal tension between personal desires and societal obligations. When she finished speaking, she glanced at Miss Roberts, expecting the usual cold response. But this time, something was different. The teacher didn't immediately dismiss her analysis. Instead, Miss Roberts sat in silence, her eyes still fixed on Jasmine, as if weighing her words. "Well," Miss Roberts said, finally breaking the silence. "That was an interesting take on the material. I still think you've overcomplicated things, but I'll admit that you've put a great deal of thought into it." Jasmine felt a surge of triumph, though she didn't allow it to show on her face. She had won this round, not just with Miss Roberts, but with herself. She had proven that she was capable, that she could stand her ground, even in the face of constant undermining. The rest of the class went by in a blur, but Jasmine didn't pay much attention. Her mind was still on the presentation. For the first time since she'd arrived at Westfield High, she felt as though she was finally starting to earn her place in the room. She wasn't just the new girl anymore. She wasn't just the daughter of the principal, either. She was Jasmine King, a student who had something to offer, someone who could make her voice heard. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jasmine packed up her things with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had won Miss Roberts' grudging respect, and she had earned the respect of her classmates, too. For the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she belonged. But her victory wasn't just personal. It was a turning point in her relationship with Miss Roberts, a subtle shift that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their dynamic. Jasmine knew the teacher wasn't going to suddenly become her ally, but for the first time, Miss Roberts had been forced to recognize her intelligence, her determination, and her ability to rise above the expectations others had placed on her. As Jasmine walked out of the classroom, she couldn't help but smile to herself. She had made her mark, and no one, least of all Miss Roberts, could take that away from her. The battle was far from over, but she had won a crucial victory. And that was just the beginning, the unseen struggle. The weeks that followed the group presentation seemed to pass in a blur. Jasmine continued to excel in her studies, pouring herself into every assignment, every project, every test. Her focus had never been sharper, and despite the ongoing tension with Miss Roberts, she began to feel a sense of quiet pride. The subtle undermining from her teacher had lessened, but Jasmine knew better than to expect this newfound calm to last forever. People like Miss Roberts didn't change easily, and Jasmine was aware that there was still much to prove. In class, things had shifted slightly. There was less open hostility from Miss Roberts, but the teacher's passive-aggressive behavior remained. She no longer targeted Jasmine directly, but every time she gave a compliment, it felt as though it were laced with sarcasm, as if she were surprised Jasmine had managed to accomplish something worthy of praise. Jasmine was used to this type of backhanded compliment. She had encountered teachers who had underestimated her before, but never like this. What most people didn't see was the toll it was taking on Jasmine. It wasn't just the battle with Miss Roberts that weighed on her, it was the constant need to prove herself, to fight for every ounce of respect. Every day felt like a battle, not just with the teacher but with the students around her who still didn't fully accept her place in the class. One afternoon, as Jasmine sat in the school library, her mind wandered to her family. Her father, Principal King, had always been a man of authority, respected by the entire school. He had always been there for her, offering advice, guidance, and encouragement. But Jasmine knew that his position made her an easy target. People often looked at her and assumed she had it easy, that she was somehow privileged or that her success was simply a result of her father's influence. But Jasmine's reality was far from the idyllic picture others painted of her life. Being the principal's daughter wasn't a ticket to an easy ride, it was a burden. She had to work harder, study longer, and perform better than anyone else just to prove she wasn't riding on her father's coattails. It had always been that way, from her first day at school to every moment in between. She had learned how to navigate the judgment and the whispers, but it still stung. What most people didn't understand was that she didn't just want to be known as the principal's daughter. She wanted to be Jasmine King, an individual with her own achievements, her own strengths, and her own identity. But when you were constantly under the shadow of someone as powerful as her father, it was almost impossible to carve out a space for yourself. The more Jasmine thought about it, the more she realized that Miss Roberts wasn't just targeting her because of her intelligence. She was targeting her because of who her father was. The teacher didn't see Jasmine as a student in her own right, she saw her as the principal's daughter, a symbol of privilege and authority. That realization hit Jasmine harder than she expected. It made her angry. It made her want to prove that she was more than just a last name. She wanted to show Miss Roberts, and everyone else, that she was worthy of respect on her own terms, not because of who her father was. The next day, as she entered Miss Roberts' class for another round of lessons, the tension was palpable. Miss Roberts was at the front of the room, as always, her arms crossed in that familiar stance, her gaze sweeping over the class as if evaluating each of them like pieces of art to be appraised. But when her eyes landed on Jasmine, something shifted. There was a new, almost imperceptible glint of challenge in the teacher's eyes, as if she were daring Jasmine to defy her once more. "All right, everyone," Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Today's assignment is a bit different. You'll each be writing a response to an essay question on the themes of family dynamics and social pressures. Make sure your answers are thorough, and don't forget to cite evidence from the text." As the class groaned in collective dismay, Jasmine's mind immediately began to formulate a strategy. This wasn't just an essay. This was another opportunity to prove herself, to show Miss Roberts and everyone else that she wasn't just a byproduct of her father's influence. She wasn't going to let this assignment be an easy pass for her. It would be the moment she needed to drive the point home. Jasmine spent the rest of the class diligently taking notes, her pen flying across the paper as she jotted down every idea that came to mind. She wasn't just going to respond to the question, she was going to break it down, show the nuances in the text that no one else had seen. This was her chance to leave a mark, one that Miss Roberts couldn't deny. When the bell rang at the end of the period, signaling the end of class, Jasmine was the last to leave. She made her way to the front of the room, where Miss Roberts was still gathering her things. Jasmine paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the teacher's gaze. Miss Roberts didn't say anything at first. She merely raised an eyebrow, as if questioning why Jasmine had lingered. "I'm turning in my assignment early," Jasmine said, her voice steady. She placed the essay on Miss Roberts' desk and met her teacher's gaze head-on. Miss Roberts didn't take the paper immediately. Instead, she gave Jasmine a long, searching look, as though trying to decide how best to respond. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Miss Roberts picked up the paper and placed it in her inbox without a word. Jasmine didn't wait for her to say anything else. She turned on her heel and left the classroom, a sense of purpose and determination propelling her forward. She knew that this wasn't just about the assignment anymore, it was about standing her ground, showing Miss Roberts that she wouldn't be underestimated. That night, as Jasmine sat in her room, she went over the essay one more time. She was meticulous, reading each line with the care of someone who knew that every word mattered. She had poured everything into this essay, every bit of energy she had into crafting a response that would leave an impression. It wasn't just about the grade, it was about sending a message. The next day, when the essays were returned, Jasmine's heart raced as Miss Roberts handed them back, one by one. The room was eerily quiet as students shuffled their papers, some looking for comments, others waiting for the inevitable grade. When Jasmine received her paper, she felt a rush of nervousness. Miss Roberts had marked it in red ink, lots of red ink. But as Jasmine scanned the paper, she saw something that made her heart stop. Miss Roberts had written, "This is the most thorough analysis I've seen this semester. Well done, Jasmine. Keep it up." For a moment, Jasmine couldn't believe her eyes. After everything, the subtle jabs, the constant undermining, the assumptions about who she was, Miss Roberts had finally acknowledged her work. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a victory. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she had won something that was truly hers. She glanced up from the paper and caught Miss Roberts watching her. There was no smile, no warm recognition, but the teacher's eyes held something more subtle, a shift in the dynamic. Miss Roberts had been forced to acknowledge Jasmine's intellect, and while the teacher might not have liked it, she couldn't deny it anymore. As Jasmine left the classroom that day, the weight she had been carrying for so long seemed a little lighter. She knew that her journey wasn't over, that Miss Roberts would continue to find ways to challenge her, but for the first time, Jasmine didn't feel like she was fighting an uphill battle. She was fighting for herself, and that was a fight she was determined to win. The battle intensifies. The days following the essay return felt like a new chapter for Jasmine. Miss Roberts' subtle acknowledgement had sparked something inside of her, an emboldened sense of purpose. Jasmine had spent so much of her life navigating the space between expectation and self-reliance, and for the first time, it felt like she was pushing through that narrow gap with undeniable force. But as much as this victory felt like a triumph, Jasmine knew that it wouldn't be enough to secure her place at Westfield High. Every new opportunity to prove herself brought with it the risk of even deeper scrutiny, and Miss Roberts had never been the type to let things go easily. While the teacher hadn't openly confronted Jasmine, the distance between them felt heavier now. Jasmine was certain that Miss Roberts was plotting her next move, waiting for a chance to knock her down again. The weight of that unspoken tension loomed over Jasmine every time she walked into the classroom. One Monday morning, as the class filed in, Jasmine noticed something different. The classroom was arranged differently, desks no longer in their usual rows but scattered around the room in tight-knit groups. It was a change that immediately unsettled her. She scanned the room for any sign of what might be coming, but Miss Roberts didn't speak right away. Instead, the teacher stood at the front of the room, arms folded, eyes darting over her students with a strange, almost amused look. "We're going to try something new today," Miss Roberts said, her voice low and deliberate. "A group project. You will be working together to write and present a persuasive essay on an important social issue. You will collaborate, you will learn how to share your ideas, and, most importantly, you will learn how to take constructive criticism from each other." Jasmine couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The idea of a group project sounded simple enough, but she knew that with Miss Roberts involved, nothing ever was. The subtle undercurrent of manipulation in the teacher's voice made it clear that there was more at stake than just the essay. Jasmine's mind raced as she scanned the room, noticing that Miss Roberts' gaze lingered on her a little longer than it did on the other students. The teacher began assigning partners, and Jasmine was paired with Tiffany, a girl who had never been particularly friendly toward her, to say the least. As the last names were called out and the room shifted into groups, Jasmine's stomach tightened. She didn't need to be told that this project had the potential to make or break her relationship with Miss Roberts. Working with Tiffany wasn't the worst part, it was the way Miss Roberts had orchestrated the situation that had Jasmine on edge. Jasmine took a deep breath as Tiffany approached her. The tension between them was palpable. Tiffany had never really warmed to Jasmine. While some of the other students had slowly started to acknowledge her, Tiffany still looked at her with suspicion, almost as if she were waiting for Jasmine to slip up. "Well, this is gonna be fun," Tiffany said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she slung her backpack over her shoulder and slumped into the chair next to Jasmine. "Let's just get this done," Jasmine replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. The two of them got to work on the project, brainstorming potential social issues to write about. Jasmine suggested they tackle something meaningful, like the intersection of mental health and social media. Tiffany, however, seemed more interested in picking a topic that was easy to research and present. "How about something simpler?" she asked. "Like bullying or peer pressure? You know, something everyone can relate to." Jasmine knew that Tiffany's approach was more about doing the least amount of work possible. But Jasmine wasn't going to let that happen. She pushed for a topic that would force them to dig deeper. "If we want this project to stand out, we need to choose something that isn't just surface level. Bullying is an easy topic. It's been done 1,000 times. Let's do something that actually makes people think." At first, Tiffany resisted, but after some convincing, she reluctantly agreed. Jasmine felt a wave of relief. The decision had been made, and now it was time to work. For the next few days, they spent their lunch breaks in the library, researching their chosen topic. Jasmine did most of the heavy lifting, sifting through studies, articles, and reports, while Tiffany sat across from her, scrolling through her phone or making disinterested comments. Jasmine couldn't help but wonder why she was even bothering. It wasn't like Tiffany cared about the quality of their work, but she wasn't about to do it alone. Not again. As the deadline approached, Jasmine felt the weight of the project settling heavily on her shoulders. She had grown used to carrying burdens for others, but the pressure now seemed endless. She couldn't help but think of her father, who had always taught her to keep pushing forward, even when the world seemed to be against her. It was his advice that had gotten her this far, but it wasn't enough to ease the anxiety that gnawed at her insides every time she thought about the upcoming presentation. The day of the presentation finally arrived, and Jasmine was a bundle of nerves. She'd worked tirelessly, refining their essay, practicing their speech, but there was always that nagging fear in the back of her mind that Miss Roberts would find fault with something, anything. After all, nothing Jasmine ever did seemed to be enough. When it was their turn to present, Tiffany stood at the front of the room, reading the first few lines of their essay in a monotone voice, her eyes scanning the paper rather than engaging with the class. Jasmine stood beside her, her heart racing as she looked over the class. She could feel Miss Roberts' eyes on her, and the pressure intensified. Every movement, every word, felt like it was being scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Jasmine stepped forward as Tiffany passed her the paper. She could hear the rustle of papers, the quiet hum of anticipation from her classmates. This was it. She had to get this right. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. She started with the research they had gathered, drawing connections between the impact of social media on mental health, particularly among teenagers. She didn't just rely on facts and figures, she brought her own perspective into it, her own experiences growing up in a world where everyone was constantly online. She spoke passionately about the importance of mental health awareness, urging her classmates to think critically about their own roles in fostering supportive online environments. As she spoke, Jasmine noticed a subtle shift in the room. Her classmates, who had been half paying attention at the beginning, were now fully engaged. Even Tiffany, who had barely contributed, seemed to be paying attention, her posture straighter as Jasmine spoke. For the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt like she was actually making an impact, not just on her classmates, but on Miss Roberts. When the presentation was over, Jasmine returned to her seat, her heart still pounding in her chest. The room was silent for a moment before Miss Roberts spoke, her voice laced with a strange blend of approval and reluctance. "Well," Miss Roberts began, her gaze locked on Jasmine. "That was a well-thought-out analysis. I still think it's a bit too ambitious for a project like this, but you certainly managed to make it compelling. I suppose I can't fault the effort." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let her guard down. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. Still, for now, that was enough. She had made a statement. She had proven that she wasn't just the principal's daughter, that she was a force to be reckoned with. And that feeling, the feeling of standing in her own light, despite the odds, was worth every moment of doubt, every challenge she had faced. Miss Roberts hadn't broken her. She had only made Jasmine stronger. And now, Jasmine knew what it meant to fight for her place in the world, the unlikely ally. Jasmine walked out of Miss Roberts' classroom that day, her mind still racing from the adrenaline of their presentation. It had been a breakthrough, but she wasn't naive enough to think that everything had suddenly changed. As the days passed, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. She had shown her strength, but the road ahead was far from smooth. It seemed that Miss Roberts had been forced to acknowledge Jasmine's intelligence, but it was clear that the teacher wasn't about to let her off easily. Despite the tension that continued to simmer between them, Jasmine felt a sense of quiet pride in what she had accomplished. No one could take away her ability to stand her ground. No one could erase the effort she had poured into that project. But as she entered the school building the next morning, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her father's position pressing down on her again. People might not say it directly, but the assumption was always there, that Jasmine had it easy, that she was only succeeding because of who her father was. The gossip about her wasn't something new, but the more she rose to the occasion, the more others seemed to shrink back in their perceptions of her. It wasn't just Miss Roberts who held her under a microscope, it was everyone. The students, her peers, even some of her friends, all had their own preconceived notions of who Jasmine King was. No one had ever taken the time to ask who she was becoming. As she entered the lunchroom that afternoon, Jasmine noticed something unusual. Tiffany, the same girl who had barely spoken to her throughout their entire partnership, was sitting at a table by herself, staring intently at her phone. Normally, Tiffany wouldn't even look at Jasmine unless absolutely necessary, but today, she was different. She seemed unsettled. Curiosity got the better of her, and Jasmine approached the table cautiously. Tiffany didn't notice her until she was standing directly in front of her. Tiffany's eyes flickered up, and for the briefest moment, Jasmine saw a flash of vulnerability in them, something she had never seen before. "What do you want?" Tiffany asked, her tone defensive. "I just thought, you looked like you needed someone to talk to," Jasmine said, unsure of why she was even offering. They weren't friends, not by any stretch of the imagination. But something about the way Tiffany seemed so distant made Jasmine feel compelled to reach out. Tiffany glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, and then lowered her voice. "You really think I need someone to talk to?" "I don't need your charity, Jasmine." Jasmine was taken aback by the harshness of the response but didn't back down. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering to listen." Tiffany stared at her, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jasmine could see the internal struggle in her eyes. After a long pause, Tiffany sighed, the tension in her shoulders visibly easing. "It's not about you, Jasmine. It's about everything else. You don't understand what it's like. Being around people who think you don't belong, people who assume everything is handed to you. And I'm not talking about just the students. I mean, it's the whole damn school. They expect me to follow in my parents' footsteps, but I don't want to. I don't want to be just the daughter of the school counselor. I don't want to be a clone of anyone." Jasmine didn't know what to say at first. She had never expected to hear this from Tiffany, of all people. The girl who always put on a mask of indifference, the one who had never shown any sign of being vulnerable, was now opening up to her in a way Jasmine hadn't thought possible. "I get it," Jasmine said quietly, taking a seat next to Tiffany. "It's not easy, being expected to live up to a certain image. I feel the same way, you know. Everyone always assumes that because my dad's the principal, everything comes easy to me. But it doesn't. I have to fight for everything I get, just like everyone else. I have to prove that I'm worth something beyond my last name." Tiffany seemed to consider this for a moment before looking at Jasmine, her expression softer now. Maybe I've been too hard on you. It's just, I've never had anyone to talk to about this kind of stuff. It's like I have to hide who I really am just to fit in." Jasmine nodded, understanding more than she had expected. "You don't have to hide who you are, Tiffany. You just have to figure out how to be true to yourself, no matter what anyone else thinks. It's hard, but it's worth it." The lunch bell rang before they could say anything more, but it felt like something had shifted between them. As Jasmine stood up to leave, Tiffany looked at her with a faint smile, something unfamiliar but real. "Thanks, Jasmine. I don't know why I'm telling you all of this, but I appreciate it." Jasmine smiled back, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change between them. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. The next few weeks passed without incident. Jasmine continued to excel in her studies and faced Miss Roberts' quiet hostility with a renewed sense of determination. The teacher's backhanded remarks became less frequent, though Jasmine knew that the battle wasn't over. Miss Roberts was still watching her, still trying to find a way to knock her down. But Jasmine was ready. Then, one morning, the unexpected happened. It was a Friday, and Jasmine was walking into class when she overheard two students talking. At first, she didn't pay much attention, but then she heard her name. "Did you hear about Miss Roberts?" one of the students said, their voice filled with curiosity. "She's not coming in today. I heard she got a really bad review from the principal. Apparently, she's been, I don't know, acting a little too harsh with some of the students." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She knew that her father had always been strict about maintaining professionalism among the staff, but she hadn't expected him to intervene in this way. Before she could process what was going on, Tiffany approached her from behind. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice tinged with something like relief. I think you did it. You made her back off." Jasmine turned to face her, confused. "What do you mean?" Tiffany gave her a small, knowing smile. "Miss Roberts isn't coming in today. Word around the school is that she's been warned about her treatment of students, especially you. And let's just say, I don't think she's going to try anything like that again anytime soon." Jasmine stood there, stunned, unsure of how to respond. Her first instinct was to feel victorious, but there was something more to it. It wasn't just about Miss Roberts' behavior, it was about the power of standing up for what was right, of fighting for yourself, even when the world around you was determined to put you in a box. The bell rang, signaling the start of class, and Jasmine walked into the room, her heart racing with a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine realized that she didn't have to fight alone. She had her own strength, her own voice, and now, she had an unlikely ally in Tiffany. Together, they had carved out a space for themselves, one where they could be more than just their parents' children. They could be themselves, unapologetically. And that was something no one could take away.